leave it in my jacket, but in any case, I sound louder. My voice resonates more with whatever I've now installed, so I'll just leave it in place. The topic which I am supposed to discuss this morning is Bolshevism and the democratic left. And I suspect the reason that this topic was assigned to me by Lou Rockwell goes back to a heated discussion, or actually it was an enthusiastic discussion, that I had at one time with Murray Rothbard. In fact, it turned into a correspondence of several years, and it was a point about which we did not disagree essentially, but about which for which we did try to provide documentation in order to explain our own perhaps prejudices in one direction or another. But it was a question of which is more dangerous, the Bolsheviks, or I suppose we called inaccurately the Mensheviks, since the Mensheviks in Russia before the revolution were in fact revolutionary socialists. But I think the term was generally used by Murray and myself to refer to those members of the left who opposed the Bolshevik in the name of some democratic principle, and we're searching for another leftist alternative, or for a leftist alternative to the democratic centralism and the revolutionary violence that had characterized the Bolshevik takeover of Russia in the October 1917 revolution. And one might say that there is both a reality and a myth of the left, which developed because of the Bolshevik Revolution. And I think perhaps it would be useful to discuss both the reality and the myth, and to try to understand the implications, one might say, less of the reality than of the myth, which lives among us. What exactly is the reality of the Bolshevik Revolution in terms of the European left? Well, we know that a split will take place. In some cases, a fragmentation will occur because of the October 1917 revolution. And there will be a proliferation of non-Soviet or non-Leninist lefts, some of which are successful and others of which are not. One unsuccessful example, of course, are the Spartacists, who in 1919 in Germany, following the defeat of World War I and the food shortages and the demobilization of German troops which followed the war, decide to carry out a spontaneous workers' revolution in Berlin, which will be crushed not only by elements of the German military that are present, but also with the support of social democrats who are then in the post-war German government. And a split will take place between the parliamentary social democrats represented by people like Gustav Noske, Friedrich Ebert, and the leaders of the Spartacist uprising, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, both of whom will be killed in the struggle, the unsuccessful struggle that takes place. And there are also other examples, of course, that one can cite of Marxist or even revolutionary Marxists, not just people who say, Marx had an interesting analysis of historical dynamics, but people who believe that Marxism must lead to revolution, but who fail in creating their own alternative to the Soviet model of democratic centralism achieved by Lenin and Trotsky, and which is very much in place once the Russian Civil War is over by 1921. The most important, one might say, well, I really don't want to confuse the picture too much by saying that there's going to be a kind of Marxist-Leninist alternatives to Stalinism, which will also develop in time. The Trotskyists. In America, there's sort of almost a kind of hothouse varieties of Marxist esoterica. There's the Lovestonites and others who come along who claim Lenin was right or Trotsky was right, but somebody else is wrong. One really has to look for ecclesiological parallels to this, like people who thought that Luther was right, but this was wrong, when the medieval church was good, but the Tridentine Council was wrong. I mean, it's almost like a breakaway groups or people who hold revisionist views about what really in many ways sees itself as a kind of post-ecclesiastical establishment, which is world communism led from Moscow. But perhaps the most important of all the groups that sort of on the left that turn their back against the Leninists and are able to establish themselves as a credible alternative are the Social Democrats in one form or another. These are people who will say that they favor socialist economics and in some cases some aspects of the Marxist view of history, but reject the violence and the dictatorship known as democratic centralism that marked the Soviet experiment. And throughout Europe, following the Bolshevik Revolution, there will be splits that take place between communist parties and socialist parties. Okay? So that in Germany you have the SPD, which is the Socialist Party, and then you have the KPD, Kommunistische Partei Deutschland, which is the Communist Party. In Italy, you have the Partito Comunista d'Italia, and then you have the Partito Socialista d'Italia. You have the communists and the socialists. Okay, and very often these parties will fight with each other. One will be subject. The same thing in France, of course. You have the Parti Communiste de France and the Parti Socialiste de France, and this takes place throughout. Throughout the European political situation in which you have communist parties dividing from socialist parties. And they will usually be antagonistic in the sense that the Socialist Party will not accept orders from the Comintern, which is the agency within Russia which dictates the communist parties throughout the world, which are seen as subject to the Soviet Union in terms of their pursuit of revolutionary strategy. The Socialist Party do not accept the Russian or Soviet paradigm as the one they are to follow, and they claim to be pursuing a democratic path to socialism. Now, some of them, as I said, in fact, will use Marxist rhetoric very often, and the Socialist Party of Germany remains theoretically a Marxist party down until 1959. Others do too. But their argument is that Marx is really a progressive humanist. And what he is telling us to do is to create a more just society, a more equitable distribution of goods and so forth, and nationalization of the means of production will help us to become a more fair society and so forth. So what these other should we say, less violent socialists will do is typically turn Marx into a kind of humanistic model for economic reform. His view of inevitable revolution or violent revolution, which is there, will typically be paid down by socialist parties. One of the most important figures for this so-called revisionist Marxism is a German named Edward Bernstein, though you get the same thing in Jean Jaurès in France, someone like Pietro Nenni in Italy. There's others who and they start off by being sort of Marxist revisionist. That is to say, they believe that Marx was a wise man, but he should not be taken too literally. It's almost like liberal Protestants reading the Bible, that this is good, but you don't want to push this too far. And there's some good things there's some bad things. You have to, make a prudential choice about these matters. So this is the Bernsteinian view that it's very famous that you cannot treat Marx like a predestinarian. History is open-ended. This is a typical Bernsteinian view. And Social Democrats, resonate to lines like that. And they also, which is very important, will run to join political coalitions, including the so-called bourgeois parties. And what you typically get thereafter is this distinction between the bourgeois parties and the workers' parties. Okay? There may not be, to use the late George Wallace's phrase, a dime's worth of difference between them, but the myth persists that one coalition or one party is the bourgeois party, because even though they're both socialist parties, do the same things, but they represent the middle class, whereas the others represent the workers' movement and the unions. Okay? Now, the unions very often are divided. Unions in some countries will have socialist components or be predominantly socialist. In other places, they'll be Marxist. Typically in France, the Confédération Générale du Travail, the Force Ouvrière, which comes out, these are going to be thoroughly Marxist. For a long time in England, the large unions, the large trade unions, mass employment unions tend to have a very strong communist component. Although they continue to support the Labour Party, sometimes they will vote communist, but they tend to have this very strong communist component. And I think in the Thatcher administration, there's a real attempt made by the government to smash them, because they're seen, I think, properly as a force that is trying to incite violent revolution. Even after the Soviets had given up on this, the English labor movement acts this way. But one might say that the Socialist Party becomes viewed generally as the moderates, trying to bring the trade unions into alliance with bourgeois parliamentary parties, being part of general coalitions, being committed to constitutional processes, to democratic rules. I think you sort of get the picture. I mean, I'm not going to really, go too far in sort of pushing the self-image of the socialists and the social democrats on you. But, generally they're seen as the good guys who are standing up to the revolutionary violence of the communists, and who are, in a sense, are the first line of defense against the communists. Because they had broken with the communists in 1919. They had turned their back on totalitarianism, as they will later, describe themselves as doing. And they had sought an alliance with capitalist parties for the sake of preserving constitutional stability and working for democratic reform. And of course there are socialists, not communists, but socialists who are in European governments. The French have a coalition which they form I think in 1910. You have Alexandre Millerand and others who are put there in the First World War. You have the Union Sacrée in France, the great coalition. They put socialists in. So there's socialists, who are put in these governments, not communists, but socialists. And all these people dutifully break from the Soviets once the communists take over. Now, what is the subsequent history of the socialist-communist relationship? Well, generally speaking, the Social Democrats hold the line against the communists, except on two important occasions. Okay, one is in the 1930s, and this is the era of the Popular Front, where the great danger is seen as Bolshevism. Not Bolshevism, I mean fascism. Not Nazism, fascism. And what you get in the Popular Front are people screaming about Mussolini, but favoring a policy of non-resistance to Hitler. I mean, the most traumatic event for the anti-fascist Popular Front coalition is the takeover of Spain by the Falange, which of course never occurred. They were wiped out by Franco, who was a military dictator who took the place over. But I mean, Spain is seen as a country in which the fascists have won. And in fact, the Germans are treated like, a kind of secondary problem within the Popular Front, because the strongest passions are really directed against Mussolini and Franco within the Popular Front. But there is a successful attempt to rally Social Democrats, communists, to this front that is going to be directed against the danger, the ascending danger of fascism. In France, in the the late 30s, you have a coalition under Léon Blum, who was a socialist or a social democrat, with the communists. It's a whole sort of left-center, leftist coalition that is going to be directed against the fascists. And the reality is that Blum did absolutely nothing. He didn't even rearm against the Germans. He gave some rhetorical support to the communists and the socialists in Spain, but didn't do much for them either. But the most important thing about the Popular Front is you see the Social Democrats making common cause with the communists, ceasing to criticize the communists. And of course, in Germany, something really important, had occurred, which is very often ignored in this period, that the German Social Democrats had stood up against the communists and the Nazis, who together destroyed the Weimar Republic. They worked hand in hand to destroy it. And the two parties which stand up against them, just about to the end, are the Catholic Center Party and the Social Democrats. And it was very much of a confrontation between the Social Democrats and the communists. And the Social Democrats were denounced by the communists as fascist. This was a common term used by Moscow. But curiously, at the same time, once the German government falls to Hitler, the Soviets are going to change the party line entirely, at least outwardly. And what you get in the 30s is the so-called Popular Front strategy of the Soviets, where they seek, at least in foreign affairs, a general alliance with all the parties of the left, in the left center, against fascism, which is sort of very vaguely defined. So that at least in France and other places, in Italy, it doesn't mean Nazi Germany, it means Mussolini, or it means Franco, or some other secondary or tertiary political figure. But for a while this continued. I say in terms of foreign policy, because there's reason to suspect that Stalin knew what he was doing in bringing Hitler to power, which he certainly cooperated in doing, and did everything he could to smash the other political parties and to get the communists in Germany, who were total instruments of the Soviet Union, to cooperate with the Nazis. And he may well have been looking for an alliance with a Nazified Germany. But at least in terms of foreign affairs, the Stalinist position is the Popular Front, from 1934 all the way down until the Soviet-Nazi Pact occurs in 1939. So it's like a 5-year period. And the Social Democrats will cease to attack the communists outside of Germany, of course, where they're just like rounded up and put in concentration camps. But they'll seek an alliance with the communists against the fascist danger. Well, after the Second World War, there will be, again, sort of a kind of very brief cooperation in some places between the socialists and communists, in Italy, to some extent in France, not much of it in Germany. In England, the Labour government after the war starts off by being almost sort of neutralist, but it becomes extremely opposed to the Soviets. Ernest Bevin, who was the foreign minister under the Labour Party, was much more strongly anti-Soviet than the American government. He thought that tanks should be lined up and marched on Moscow at the time of the Berlin blockade. So you get some very feisty anti-communist Social Democrats again emerging in this period. And then again by the 50s, in places like France and Italy, other Western countries, you get Social Democrats cooperating against the communists. This becomes more problematic, however, I think, in the later stages of the Cold War, where the Social Democrats move toward more of a kind of neutralist position. And most importantly, since the end of the Cold War, the Social Democrats have run to embrace the communists as coalition partners all over Europe. They will never speak against them. Lino Jospin, the Premier of France, in fact, made a speech about a year and a half ago pointing out to us that all these stories about Soviet atrocities were made up, by the French right, in fact, by old Vichy supporters and so forth. And the Communist Party has always stood on the side of freedom and equality against fascism. This was partly to keep the communist coalition partners in his government. The French had a sort of strange system of we have to sort of, it's called apparentement. We try to keep these people in your, in your, on your side, no matter what, you go out of your. But of course, if any of this was done to the National Front on the right, saying they're not really fascists, they're nice guys, that person would probably be torn limb from limb by the media, the journalists as he tried to leave, or by members of the Communist Party. But when we're talking about the most despicable and continuing denial of the Holocaust, I mean, the socialist government of France denies Soviet crimes, openly, because it needs the communists in its coalition. And if you take a look at the German Social Democrats, or whatever they are, which have pretty much destroyed German democracy now and put people in jail for disagreeing with the government and so forth, what you see is an alliance with the East German Communist Party. No problem. Against the so-called bourgeois parties, which are, on economic matters, usually indistinguishable from the socialists. But I think that this, of course, in Italy, the same thing. The Ulava coalition has the socialists, the communists, they all cooperate. Now, looking at this, can one speak about a consistent social democratic opposition to the communists? I think what you can speak of is not a consistent opposition, but rather shall we say, an opposition that goes on for long periods of time before it gets reversed. What I would argue is that there is always a family resemblance between the Social Democrats and the Communists, which it is not nice to talk about, but is obviously there. And the question is exactly what is it based on? Well, first, I mean, to use a term I think was an expression which was originally presented, I think, by the late James Burnham, there is the gestalt of the left. There's a leftist pattern of thought, okay? And it is natural that the Social Democrats support the Communists, just as it is natural that the Iron Guard in Romania lands up on the side of Adolf Hitler in the Second World War. You don't have to be... Mussolini made it a little problematic, but the Iron Guard you're not surprised about. Or some of these, tougher, more militant right-wing nationalist groups and so forth. So one should not be surprised that Social Democrats land up fawning on communists from time to time. Or that they generally perceive the right as being more of their enemy than other people who are associated with the left. Okay, I think everything being equal, this is a predictable situation. Now, I have a former student of mine whose PhD I once directed, who is a violently anti-communist social democrat, who would probably be by now sputtering with rage. He'd probably take his bottle of water and smash my head with it or something, because he thinks the real heroes against the commies are the social. They're the good guys. They're the ones like Bevin and others who fought against the communists. And in a certain case, it's true. I mean, at various times, it is the Social Democrats, the Truman Democrats, and sort of looking at their American equivalents today, the neoconservatives, who have been the strong anti-communists who have borne the brunt of the fighting against at least the propagandistic front. Although they volunteer to fight in the army, but they make a lot of noise against the communists, and they denounce the communists. But there is this leftist gestalt, which I think remains there and has to be looked at. And part of it is a belief that the human race can be amalgamated, reconstructed, and resocialized by public administration. And if you believe all those things, you're going to simply look at the communists, or you may look at the communists at the end, as people who share your goals, your teleology, but are a bit in a hurry. They're sort of like us, but they're just rushing toward this end a little irresponsibly in a helter-skelter fashion. Number two, I think since the 1930s, the ideology of the left, or at least the enemy of the left, not the enemy of the left, has been fascism. What unites them is anti-fascism. Now, the question is, what is fascism? That's a very good question, because by now I don't have no idea what they mean by it, except people who disagree with them. Right? But there's something called fascism, which is the demonic force in the universe, because it's a Manichaean view, which not the right, the left has. The fascism is their enemy. And fascism is that which does not correspond to their view of where we should be historically or what we are marching toward. And I think that the hatred of this generic fascism, which is less and less, becomes more and more uncoupled from what happened in the 1930s. It has nothing to do with corporatism or Italian nationalism or German racial theory. It just means not being in sync with where these people want to go. This makes you a fascist. But anti-fascism, since the 1930s, has been, one might say, an integral component of the leftist ideology, whether communist or social democratic. Finally, as I said before, there is a commitment, a shared commitment on the left to the reconstruction of society by public administration and the identification of public administration with popular government. Okay? One might say that part of this is an objection to the free market, a desire to restrict the free market. I think by now, however, I would argue that is simply a necessary result, but not an intention. Because I don't think the left anymore really is interested in destroying what remains of market capitalism, although the necessary result of what it does is to destroy it in the end. Because I think what the left understands is you need market capitalism to create sufficient prosperity to carry out all their other lunatic projects. So I mean, you have to have, a functioning economy. People have to have jobs. People have to have consumer goods, all of which capitalism provides, in order to fight sexism, racism, homophobia, all the other things you want to do. You have to have some, but it is social reconstruction of a different kind. But this has basically been what the left has been about, since the early 20th century. It's 100 years by now. So that the social democrats become, I think, an extremely questionable, provide a kind of extremely questionable leadership in a crusade against the totalitarian left. It's like making the leader of a struggle against world Nazism some dissenting Nazis, right? And saying that you might want to let them into your coalition, but you don't want them to take it over. Because otherwise, you're going to get Goebbels running it rather than Hitler or somebody like that. I mean, you basically don't want the left to be running a struggle against communism. I mean, it's a very bad idea. But this, I think, is what has happened this was what happened in the Western world. I think that as the Cold War went on, it became increasingly associated with that part of the left which had not sold out entirely to the communists. Okay, there's part of the left that did. People running around, excusing the communists. Even now, I think there was this, I was a little bit shocked actually when Ralph mentioned that Jerry Hoff at Princeton had said there were, fewer than 10,000 people killed by Stalin or this. But I shouldn't be. I have a colleague who was a minister of the Church of the Brethren, a kind of social gospel Christian who was once very upset with the remark that I made after he came in to see me, that I suggested that Stalin killed millions of people, and he pointed out to me that President Reagan killed far more people as a result of our policy in Nicaragua. And I was trying to figure out, demographically, that didn't work. If you kill everybody, in Central America, you don't even get into figures, of people killed by Stalin. So, this Holocaust denial is simply part of this sort of anti-communist mentality, that the communists don't really kill people, that there may be a few suspension of civil liberties, but they don't mind that either, since the anti-communist left is very happy to suspend civil liberties here too. But the point that I'm driving at is that a split is going to occur within the left between those. It will be a continuing split in a sense. Those who support the communists for one reason or another, those who excuse them, those who like them, those who see them as an immediate model for us, and those who oppose the communists but still carry on the leftist gestalt. And my argument is the people who carry around the leftist gestalt but oppose the communists are the ones who win the Cold War. Okay, I mean, these are the neoconservatives, the Cold War liberals. The person I remember that Murray used to mention most often as the embodiment of Cold War liberal leftism was Sidney Hook. And I think you're sort of placing too much of an historical burden on Hook, but the illustration was perfectly good. I mean, Hook to his dying day thought Marx was fine. He had been misunderstood in the Soviet Union. He was a great atheist humanist, whose example we should follow in the United States. And Hook thought of himself as a socialist. But the communists were bad because they were really on the right. I mean, this is part of the anti-communist left mentality, that the communists aren't true social democrats, or the communists really aren't good to the labor unions, or they do some of the things which the right does, and therefore they're really Russian autocrats. You've got a Scoop Jackson sort of argument that this is Russian autocracy. So what you're basically getting are leftist reasons to oppose the Soviet Union. It's not that these people are moving to the right, it is just that they are able to recast the Soviets in terms of a leftist demonology. That they are really, there's a famous red fascist kind of image that Truman came up with, that, the fascists are now the Reds. So I think what you basically have is a struggle against communism that is going to be recast as a war between right and left, in which we are the left and the communists are on the right. And I think if you look at things like the National Endowment for Democracy, various Scoop Jackson satellite organizations and so forth, this was pretty much the arguments that were made. That the Soviets were anti-Semitic, like the Nazis, the Soviets were Russian nationalists, this sort of stuff. But there were, all of which may have been perfectly true, by the way. They may have been all these things and worse. But the argument that was presented was an essentially leftist argument for opposing the Soviet Union. Now, one could say that the reason that this is being done is that these social democrats and leftist ideologues who are anti-Soviet are really having to argue with other people who are pro-Soviet and on the left. Now, that's partly true. It's an argument on the left, because there is not much of a right that's left by the end of the Cold War. There's a very small sort of free market right, which a few localists like the Lega Nord, but there isn't very much left on the right. The left is all over. And even by the 70s and 80s, what you basically get is the anti-communist left having to argue with the pro-communist left. So they say, supporting the Soviets is not a good idea because they really are right-wingers. They do all the things the fascists did and so forth. Now, this is true. I mean, this, one might say, is determined by the logic of the of the situation. But I would say, going beyond that, it's also what the people who are anti-communists believe. That the reason, we are opposed to Soviets. You read Norman Podhoretz's early articles. Why am I against the Soviets? They don't support Israel. They behave like the Black Hundred under the Tsar. They're terrible right-wing reactionaries. This is the reason why I'm an anti-communist. But it is not the reasons that Joe McCarthy would have given, right? It's certainly not the reasons that Francisco Franco would have given. So name at least two of the heroes, I think, of Pat Buchanan's father. There was a third one. Who was the third one? Was it MacArthur? Or I think this was, I think, the example given by Charles Krauthammer that the most telling example that Buchanan was a Nazi. Aside from the fact he didn't favor NAFTA, was that his father admired MacArthur, Franco, and McCarthy. But I mean, obviously, these people would have been anti-communists of a different kind from the anti-communism, expressed by Charles Krauthammer. But I think that this is an important point to keep in mind, that the people who sort of lead the rhetorical propagandistic war against the communists by the end of the Cold War are simply variants on the other side that is then soft on the communists. And they both, find leftist reasons for taking the positions that they do. All of which sort of brings me to my final point, which is, how is the sort of split between the Social Democrats and communists played out? And I would say that, in my own judgment, I'm very happy to see the communists, or at least the Soviet communists, lose. I don't think we won very much on our side. And this is because of the way the struggle turned out. And the struggle turned out that the people who broke from the communists and their descendants and their recognizable progeny are the ones who in the end land up defeating the communists in circumstances that could only help the left and help the leftist project. For which one might say the Soviet communist becomes more and more extraneous in terms of the Western world. And that we are still left, one might say, with the legacy of the social democratic split, the successful social democratic split from the communists, because the social democrats, in splitting from the communists, become the paradigm or the model of democratic resistance to the communists. And it is this model of democratic resistance to the communists that we land up sort of taking over as the only acceptable model of resistance to the communists, which at the same time points toward the direction of our own political future. We should not be too surprised, as I would finally observe, that the victors in the struggle, the victors of the struggle against communism in the Cold War have been almost entirely on the left. The left has done very well. A point that I'll come back to in one of my later lectures is, or at least an observation, is that the end of the Cold War looks like the end of the Second World War. Even though we have defeated the communists, we have like anti-fascist purges going on all over the place. Why don't we have anti-communist purges? Why are communist mass murderers in Germany not only not persecuted, but given state pensions? This is interesting. Could you imagine people who served in Hitler's government not being tried, but being given state jobs, and sent away, with bouquets of flowers? But this is exactly what we're seeing at the end of the Cold War. And I think in order to understand this, one has to understand that the left won the Cold War. Part of the left, one might say the more archaic Asiatic part of the left, is defeated. But the side of the left that is most relevant for our fates, that side which is most relevant, turns out to win the war. And we are still living with the consequences, one might say, of the social democratic split from the communists that occurs after the Bolshevik Revolution. Well, I've probably given you a lot to digest, but if there are any questions, I shall gladly entertain them.
Yeah. Yes, sir. Where does Gramsci figure in all this? And why does Sam Hill as a Gramsci society still exist?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Gramsci is sort of an interesting example of an anti-Marxist Marxist. There is nothing really Marxist about his theory. It's Hegelian. He believes in the reality of consciousness, that you turn around political, economic conditions by changing people's consciousness. And he actually is a Italian Hegelian who joins the Communist Party and spends a good deal of his life actually in prison. He's imprisoned by the Italian fascists. They don't treat him too badly. But his ideas seem to be perfectly correct. That, in order to change socioeconomic, political institutions, one must be able to control the culture, the intellectual life, of a society. And there has been a Gramscian, one might say, march or sprint through Western institutions that we see, so that all these forms of political correctness have now been absorbed by people and so forth. This never happened under communism, which is interesting. That most people living under Soviet occupation did not believe this stuff. They were just being occupied. They're being occupied by the Russians. Many of these people hated the Russians. Even those who didn't hate the Russians, like the Serbs or the Czechs, ended up hating them in the end. But there was no mistaking this for democracy. But what is so successful about this Gramscian transformation of Western institutions is that people, allow themselves to be controlled by the political class, by the media, and so forth, and assume this is freedom. But again, it is not a Marxist scenario we're looking at, because it is not a controlling of socioeconomic, it's a control of cultural institutions in which the political and the socioeconomic institutions all fall in place after.
Is it correct to say that Mensheviks were social democrats by your definition?
Well, I mean, there was actually a social democratic party in Russia that was separate from the Mensheviks. The Mensheviks were actually started out as the majority communist, but they do sort of fall back once the revolution takes place on what becomes a social democratic position, and they become social democrats once they lose to the Leninists in the Soviet Union. I think we sort of using them sort of as a kind of shorthand, for all of these non-Leninist socialists.
I just want to ask sort of what became of the right, probably as the left, two sides of the left fighting out the Cold War. What did happen to the right? Where did it go?
It's a very good question, because I would argue that even despite the Second World War and the kinds of purges and massacres of people on the right that take place afterwards, by the early 50s, you have sort of at least the democratic right being in control again. I mean, you have the Christian Democrats in Germany who are fairly conservative, and then you have Erhard, who's kind of classical liberal, becoming the German chancellor. In France, you have a president in the 50s who's a man of the right. Then you have the Gaullists taking over. In Italy, the left has pretty much spent its forces by the late 40s. By the early 50s, there's a kind of swing back toward the Social Democrats, Christian Democrats rather, who are fairly conservative in the Italian back then. And as late as the 1960s, what seems the neo-fascist Movimento Sociale d'Italia gets lots and lots of votes. It gets 17, 18% of the vote. There are parties on the German right that were well to the right of the Republikaner in Germany now that were doing very well in the 50s and 60s. So there is a movement, one might say rightward, that occurs after the Second World War, though I think it has been pretty much downhill through the last quarter of the 20th century, despite this apparent restoration of conservative values under Thatcher and Reagan, which really went nowhere. Although I think Thatcher did smash these communist unions, which were dinosaurs at the time she smashed them. But the most important thing that I think, as Peter Hitchens points out in his book on the abolition of Britain, is that the cultural institutions stay entirely in the hands of the lunatic left. And not just the communist left, the lunatic left. The communists at least believe in bourgeois morality. The part of the left that takes over are entirely whacked out, but they're very successful. They push feminism, gay rights, multiculturalism, and so forth, all of which succeed for reasons that I go into in my sequel to After Liberalism on the politics of guilt. But I think the destruction of the right is pretty much achieved by the 1980s. The Reagan Revolution was no revolution of any kind. It's a continuation of the Carter administration under a new name. The taxes did not fall very much in this period. Social Security payments went up to make up for the slight reduction in the amount of taxes that we were granted by the government. And much of the rhetoric of the Reagan administration, as I've pointed out ad nauseum, is this Cold War liberal stuff. The Cold War liberals take over the government here, and to a large extent in England. So that's what we have of a political right. So I think the cultural institutions are so entirely taken over by the left that no matter what happens economically, the left is going to win, and the right just keeps moving leftward. What I did not know when I wrote my book on the conservative movement, in which I lambasted the neocons, is that things like this were occurring all over the Western world. Exactly. You were having, social democrats, Cold War liberals sort of taking over the right, dislodging everybody else. There seems to be a common characteristic of the Western world in the last quarter of the 20th century. Lou?
Well, what about the role of the CIA and other U.S. government institutions in promoting this?
neocons here and in Europe, useful partners in the Cold War.
This goes on from the end of the Second World War on. I mean, this is the CIA and things like the Congress for Cultural Freedom were recipients of American anti-communist money that almost always on the left. I mean, there are very few examples of conservative anti-communist organizations being subsidized by the CIA and other agencies that are set up to fight communism. And, of course, the perfect ally is always a social democratic ally. Now, originally, this may not have been the ideology of the CIA. It may have been, the pursuit of strategy, of Cold War or geopolitical strategy or whatever else. But I think in time, if you actually read statements by leaders of the CIA, they also move to the left. So what becomes the institution associated with fascism, Francoism, is basically a leftist institution, the CIA. Or, it is like one of the major sponsors of the non-communist left throughout the Western world.
What do you make of the new elected prime minister in Italy? Is he just staying in that same tradition?
Well, I actually wanted to speak about this in one of my later talks. I don't think he's going to make much of a difference.
But he's billed as this big entrepreneur type, or all this other stuff surrounding him, and I just am curious: is he just more the same that Italy's always seen?
Well, I think that the one good thing about Berlusconi is not that he's the premier of Italy, but that his networks did create an alternative to the dismally leftist state networks in Italy and in other European countries. So he did create an alternative, and there were conservative points of view, and there are conservative points of view that you hear on his channels. I listened to him when I was in Jordan, and I was actually very impressed by this. I was generally impressed by the reporting and so forth. The problem is that the price of his victory has been to destroy what there is of an Italian right, either a nationalist right, a localist right in the case of the Lega Nord. I mean, they've been reduced to insignificance.
Why?
Well, I mean, there's various reasons which I think Luigi Marco Bassani can probably go into because he knows more about this since he was one of the Leghisti, but has now resigned from the Lega. But a lot of this has to do with the dynamics of these right-wing political formations and the fact that some of them have given up on positions they took, have tried to have sort of thrown away their own positions to ally themselves with Berlusconi, who's a centrist. They've lost their votes, whereas Berlusconi's vote has increased. His own party within the Casa della Libertà has done very, very well. The Forza d'Italia, they've done well. The others have not done well. So the Wall Street Journal was delighted with the outcome because you have a neoconservative government in Italy. The kind of welfare state, centrist kind of government that they like, which is not going to rock the boat very much. And those parties that were farther to the right have now been marginalized. So I think that has been the price of the Berlusconi victory.
What do you think of the development of kind of left of center parties that call themselves centrists, kind of like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, and their schism, or at least it seems, I don't know a great deal about the liberal Democrats here, but it seems like the schism was farther left here. Do you think that's significant, or that's going to go anywhere, like with the NATO rights and the Democrats here?
I find that a very interesting split. No, it does not exist on the continent because there everybody's allied with the communists. And the communists, are the leaders. I mean, they get up there, they anti-fascist, criminalizing speech. I mean, the communists control the socialists in Europe. It's there are two books that have appeared in French in the last 2 years. One by Maurice de Rouen, who was actually at one time a kind of left-of-center French politician, but it's on the Communist Party, showing how they dominate France. It's always the Communist Party, and they've been able to sort of control things from behind the scenes for years. Now they're just out there in front. And they've gotten rid of some of the less workable things like immediate nationalization of the means of production, since so much of French production is already nationalized, like the transportation and so forth. But what they now typically push is anti-fascism, the Holocaust, sexism, multiculturalism. But it's a way of controlling society, nonetheless. Totally controlling it in the name of, sensitivity, fighting prejudice, and so forth. The other book is by a man named Eric Wernel, who's a French-Swiss writer, called L'après-démocratie. I'm a friend of his. He's sending me his book. But his attempt to show to what extent the communists have been able to totalitarianize the continent. I mean, the socialists are just dummies. They're all dummy parties. It's the communists who are running the place. And the communists basically have total thought control, throw people in jail for this. And the socialists are basically, what they would have been if they went along with Lenin. And this is his argument. They're basically back in that position of total subordination to the communists. Now, in England and the United States, though, I think what you have are these sort of yuppie left coalitions led by Clinton, Gore, and in their most distasteful, grotesque, and effeminate fashion, Tony Blair. I must tell you that I would vote for Clinton 100 times. He's a much more appetizing figure than Blair. Blair is almost sort of epicene, effeminate, is married to this hideous feminist wife who's always, who, by the way, was voted the most popular woman in England, Sherry Blair. I'm sure it tells you, how decadent the English have become. But there I think you have a problem between the politically correct left, which are the Clintonites and the Blairites and so forth, and the hardline socialists, who don't like these people because they've sold out to the capitalists. Generally, if you read the French newspaper Le Monde, which I don't suggest you read, it's a disgusting paper, but you always have, usually it's the politically correct left they represent, multiculturalism, fighting the remnants of Vichy government. I mean, it's like, it never goes away, the Vichy government. It keeps coming back. It comes back every week. They're like 98 years old. They're being kept alive on respirators, and they keep coming back. But the Monde loves this. They get their jollies out of fighting the Vichy government. But then every now and then you have somebody writing saying, we really have forgotten the working class. And we need is, nationalization, the means of this and this. So they will publish those sorts of things. And obviously, these are the representatives of the Force Ouvrière, the labor union movement, who aren't happy with the direction in which, the multicultural yuppie direction in which this has happened. This is true of the Communist Party in Italy has now become a yuppie, politically correct, multicultural party. But there's like old-line Marxists who apparently have just crossed over and now vote for the right. A lot of them vote for the Alleanza Nazionale, which is the right nationalist party, because the communists do not serve the working class. They basically serve transgendered hippies or something like that. So but there must be a lot of them, in these European countries who vote for them. But they're basically losing working class support, and they're picking up middle class, young professional support. Okay, so the party has changed. Yes.
One of the things I always hear, and I've never really pursued this, and maybe you know, maybe you don't know, I'm just throwing a question, but a lot of the Italian economy is underground. And if that's true, then what does that mean for things like this that you're talking about in terms of...
You said if it's underground, you said? Or?
Yeah. In other words, they have two sets of books. That there's a certain amount of wealth that continues on in Italy that is significantly protected because it's not ever reported.
Okay, yeah.
What does that mean for the agenda of, the Democratic Socialists or even the Fascists or any of these people who would want to control those resources because they need the capitalism to sustain their efforts?
Well, I don't know how much money they have underground, but there is this theory that this Maurice Drouin and others put forth that the communists really haven't changed, and they favor the hardline economic totalitarian positions, but they're just like running with these yuppie degenerates and something, because in the meantime, this is, where you're going to get votes. It's like all these people in New York who vote for Hillary or something. These are the people who are going to vote for them. So there's a very large number of these sort of liberated women, self-actualizing yuppies, multicultural, who are going to support the communists if they run as that kind of party. But once they're able to establish control and to pretty much drive out the right, marginalize disagreement, throw people in jail in the name of sensitivity, which they do. Once they can achieve these things, they have a kind of Stalinist society, and then introduce their economic programs. And I've heard this argued. I don't know whether it's true. I wouldn't be surprised if it were. Because obviously this Communist Party doesn't sound like the old Communist Party. I mean, it sounds like, it sounds like Hillary Clinton going crazy or something, but it doesn't sound like the old Communist Party. But, the totalitarian methods are the same,
What is the name of your book on the conservative movement? Do they have it here?
Yeah, he has a copy of it. The Conservative Movement.
Right.
Oh.
Okay, is there any, I don't know, have we completed the hour? Is there time rather for more questions? Anybody have any other question? Okay.